Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. This is Rob Scott, and this is the presentation on hot topics in Microsoft Enterprise License Agreements and Cloud. I thank everybody for joining today. Jumping right into the agenda, we have a lot to cover in this hour. I want to make sure that we get to as many of these topics as we possibly can. The first thing we're going to cover is the licensing models that are available with Microsoft. And Microsoft, like many other publishers, is in the middle of a significant shift, a paradigm shift from perpetual-based licensing to cloud-based licensing and subscription-oriented licenses versus perpetual licenses. And with that comes a major shift away from device-oriented licensing and device-oriented counting metrics to user-oriented counting metrics. Years ago, when I first started doing enterprise license negotiations for Fortune 500 companies, I was constantly trying to edit Microsoft's enterprise agreements to alleviate the burden of large global corporations from having to count devices, and trying to redefine things like qualified devices in terms of users. And now, fast forward 10, 15 years later, Microsoft is offering models today, including the SPE offering, which we'll get into, which now you can license just about every product that they offer, including the operating system for the desktop, on a user-based metric, which from a accounting and compliance risk perspective is the best option available. Many of my clients are in hybrid models that are part user and part device, but I advise my clients wherever possible, wherever it's economically viable, to move to user-based licensing metrics, because I've never had a client ever, in the hundreds of clients that I've represented over the years, who couldn't put their fingers on accurate HR records more easily and quickly than they could count devices in terms of computer devices within an environment. So anytime you have user-based metrics, much easier to count an account versus device-based metrics. We'll go into the agreement types, the structure of Microsoft licensing, how they're put together at the top level, the Microsoft Business and Services Agreement. Some people refer to that as the master agreement. In many cases, there are the online subscription agreements, which cover the O365 and other cloud-based offerings. And there's the enterprise agreements and enrollments. And then many of my clients with enterprise agreements also have the MPSA, formerly known as the Select. This is the non-enterprise open license agreement that in many instances will ride alongside an enterprise agreement, or for those of my clients that are not large enough or for other reasons don't choose enterprise agreement, the MPSA agreement is the vehicle of choice for open license purchases. Jumping into the agenda on the legal issues, one of the biggest things that I try to help my clients with is defining their requirements up front. We find that deals with Microsoft, particularly enterprise deals with Microsoft, go best when you have a very clear set of requirements up front. The deals that don't go well are the deals with shifting requirements throughout the negotiation. I try to urge my clients to document their requirements in the form of a PowerPoint or other clear writing to be shared with Microsoft's business team very early in the process. And the discipline of defining requirements early is one that transcends Microsoft transactions and applies to tech transactions across the board. We're going to show you how to build a term sheet for Microsoft, which also can be used in any kind of a cloud deal. You'll see on the right there's a section called Handouts, and you'll see the Scott & Scott term sheet builder for Microsoft is one of the handouts. I'm sure you guys that are interested in negotiating with Microsoft or other cloud vendors will get a benefit from taking a look at how we organize our term sheets and what the most common negotiated terms are by category, and I encourage you to pull that term sheet down as we work through the slides. As you'll see on the term sheet, there's a number of these limitations of liability, true-up terms, price protection, business downturn, restacking. Restacking is a concept that was invented many years ago. I was dealing with a client, very large organization, global company, was at the 11th hour. Microsoft was holding a gun to their head on New Year's Eve. It was about 12 o'clock at night. We had to get a deal done, but all of the counts for the deal were not firm. And so we came up with a concept that we would go forward with the deal, but that we would have the ability to do some shuffling within the product suite with the same revenue stream at a time in the future. I think in that deal it was 6 months after the deal was signed. And this restacking concept has now come up in a number of different contexts today. A close cousin to it is the server migration language that we sometimes negotiate for customers who are entering into an enterprise agreement with the understanding that their cloud adoption will be increasing during the term and wanting not to pay twice for server workload, server products that are currently on premises that are anticipated to move to the cloud. So this restacking concept has evolved over the years, but it's essentially a flexibility builder for allowing some restacking of your product set within the agreement. We'll talk about audit rights. As many of you know, we spend a great deal of our time defending our clients in disputed audits with Microsoft and other vendors, and we have found that negotiating audit provisions is the best defense to audits. So we'll go into that a little bit more. We'll go into detail on regulatory compliance. You know, years ago, I thought that the cloud would be a good tool for storing photos, maybe storing music, maybe for doing some things at home. And then years ago, I represented one of the largest banks in the world in their migration from on-prem Exchange to 365. A year later, I helped one of the largest hospital groups navigate the HIPAA regulations to move their workload on Exchange to 365. And what I learned is that regulatory compliance and regulatory issues, along with data privacy and security, are the key challenges to cloud adoption. And yet, done correctly, it is possible even for the most heavily regulated industries to move to Microsoft's cloud if that's the direction that people want to go in. As you guys may know, many of our clients are very large companies with very broad global holdings, including many affiliates and different types of business arrangements throughout the world. And sometimes Microsoft's affiliate definition doesn't exactly fit their business needs in terms of doing business in countries where maybe they don't own greater than 50% of the equity of the business that needs to access the IT infrastructure. So we'll look at affiliate definition. How you define your enterprise for purposes of your enterprise agreement can have significant implications for acquisitions and divestitures, and we'll go into some of the key terms that we talk about in that context as far as negotiating on behalf of our clients. So jumping in then to the sea change, you know, one of the most interesting things about what's happening in the world today is that as a group, all of our businesses are putting all of our customer data in the hands essentially of 3 or 4 providers, Microsoft being one of them, and we're just moving wholesale to the cloud. And the amazing thing about it is that the cloud providers are telling us with their agreements that if something goes wrong, we're not going to be responsible. So we're moving a cattle call essentially to the cloud, and we really, I don't think, have taken into account the full implications of what will happen when the data goes missing. And I think you would be scared to learn that as a group, these main cloud providers that probably are making up 80% of the cloud storage in the world as a group are taking very little financial and legal responsibility for what will happen in the event of a major leak or breach. So it's a scary proposition, but there are a lot of drivers that are driving the change away from perpetual to subscription-based models. And I would say that the biggest is the accounting treatment. When originally, back in the day, you'd do an enterprise agreement, you would book as capital the enterprise license, and you'd book as expense the maintenance and support or software assurance. For many businesses today, there is a preference when it comes to IT away from capital expenditures in favor of operating expense. Similarly, there is a desire for many businesses to get out of running their own data centers. There's a desire for many businesses that don't have IT as a core competency to get out of providing security and hiring large IT organizations to manage email and to manage applications and to run and replace and manage hardware. And the cloud is unique in its opportunity to bundle a unique set of software, infrastructure, and services together in a way that really is a simple and low-cost approach that businesses really like. I think that from a financial perspective, the cloud is a no-brainer. It's just when guys like me get involved and say, what if this happens? And what if that happens? And what about these regulations, that people start to get a little bit nervous about adopting the cloud. But I think the move to the cloud is upon us. I think those companies that are late to the party will be at a disadvantage to those that are early adopters, with that big caveat of what happens when the proverbial fit hits the shan. And we'll get into that a little bit later. One of the key differences that the cloud brings is a difference in how you account and count for the licensing metrics. In a device-based model, you're essentially licensing a device, whether it's a desktop, a laptop, or a server for use. And for example, if you're a hospital like many of my clients, or a call center like many of my clients, you may have 3 users per device. It would be somewhat crazy for a call center, for example, that has 3 shifts to have 3 user-based licenses when 1 device-based license could suffice. Similarly, a hospital that has a nursing station where the nurses rotate in and out and share a computer, they have a preference for device-based licensing instead of licensing each of the nurses that touch that computer. The problem that comes into play with device-based licensing, particularly in the large enterprise, is it becomes wildly expensive to count and keep track of devices and the software that is running on them. I have clients that spend literally millions of dollars every year just counting devices, tracking down hardware, deploying discovery tools to the hardware, reviewing the discovery tool data against Active Directory data and antivirus data, running scripts, doing checks, running reconciliations, and all of this is very time-consuming and fraught with a great deal of risk. For example, if you have a device-based license and a user goes home and accesses their mail from their home computer or from their email, or goes to a hotel and accesses through web access, that device-based license doesn't cover that use. And so device-based licensing have limited license grants, although the attractiveness of the lower cost, particularly in the multiple user per device context, is very enticing to begin with. It is fraught with peril, both in terms of ability to account and track, and prove compliance and defend audits, as well as the limited nature of the license grant can become a problem as well. For that reason, Microsoft has answered the call that many of the large enterprise customers have made to say, I want to just count my users, I want to pay for users, and I don't want to be worried about all of these different licensing rules for all of these different products and counting devices and running discovery. I just want to have an identity management system that's tied to my HR system, and I want to use a very simple cloud-based, user-based approach to licensing. Historically, you weren't able to license, for example, the operating system on a user basis. But today, Microsoft offers solutions that will allow you to have a user-centric, subscription-based licensing model to cover just about all of their product sets. I have found that my clients say, when they evaluate the SPE offering, Secure Productive Enterprise offering, which was formerly known as the Enterprise Cloud Suite, that it comes at a significant premium over device-based or hybrid models. I would say the most typically my clients are in what I call hybrid models, where they're using user-based models for mail and 365, but on the desktop devices, and with respect to the server applications, they're using device-based models as opposed to user-based models. But I think the future, particularly for Microsoft, as far as where they want to go, and the future overall, I think is going to drive us further and further away from device-based models to a more user-centric approach to licensing, which, as a lawyer that defends software audits and helps clients set up software asset management programs, is a welcome change, because when you evaluate the cost of a secure productive enterprise agreement that is user-centric, and then you reduce from that cost your software asset management expenses associated with the change and your audit and compliance risks associated with the change, I think the delta between the two licensing models is a lot smaller than it looks upon first blush. I recommend to my clients that are doing enterprise deals to look at multiple versions of options. I like to tell my clients, look at a get legal only option and a hybrid option and then an SPE option, and then make a decision based on the three different options and the financial implications of each. Looking at the structure of how Microsoft's put its agreements together, this is a somewhat old slide for you Microsoft experts in the audience, of which I'm sure there are many. You'll notice at the top of this slide here, you see the words Select and Select Plus. These are deprecated licensing schemes that are primarily been replaced with the MPSA, but the general scheme here is still in place, that you've got the MPSA level, which is the Microsoft Business and Services Agreement, MPSA. That's going to be a lot of people will refer to that as the master agreement. That's going to be the agreement that contains a lot of the basic terms and conditions, but it's not an agreement through which you're going to order anything. Then you have the program level. This would be enterprise agreement or MPSA or open license. So that's the program that you have.
Yes.
And then you have the order level. That's going to be your enrollment. So that could be your enterprise enrollment. That would be your affiliate enrollments, and that could be your license purchases. So this gives you the basic structure. When we generally get involved in negotiating license agreements, we start with the base package. So Microsoft will issue a base package of software agreements. And in many instances, we will either propose a custom amendment to the various levels of the agreement, and in rare instances, we'll actually redline each of the documents. But most of the time, we start with their basic stack, and we work through with a number of custom amendments to each of the document sets. The online subscription agreement is a agreement that also contains the data processing terms. It can also deal with customers' duty to protect information. It can also have limitations of liability provisions in it. And most importantly, we'll have Microsoft's security commitments. Sometimes these provisions will be incorporated into a newer form of the MPSA. You may have an agreement structure where the OST or online subscription terms are a separate attachment, and you may have OST terms embedded into the MPSA. Regardless of where they reside, there is a number of key terms here that you need to be worried about. I would say the one that we spent the most significant amount of our time on is related to the security commitments. We will work with our clients' security teams to make sure that Microsoft's security commitments, as documented in the agreement, are consistent with the client's security requirements from a vendor perspective and from a data protection perspective. Because as many of you will know, once you make the change from on-prem, where you're licensing a perpetual license or a subscription that's being run on-prem, where Microsoft doesn't have access to your customer information, as soon as you transition to online, regardless of what industry you're in, whether you're regulated under HIPAA or GLBA or any other regulation or just state privacy and security laws, once you now put your customer data into Microsoft's cloud, you've opened up a whole slew of security and privacy concerns that didn't exist when you were running these same programs in an on-premises environment. So the security commitments that are being undertaken goes in part to the discharging of your due diligence requirements, of which many regulatory schemes have. And so carefully vetting Microsoft security commitments, benchmarking them against the client's security commitments, is a key aspect of negotiating an enterprise agreement that involves cloud utilization or anticipated cloud adoption. And it's one of those things that needs to be carefully documented in order to make sure that the client is discharging its due diligence obligations. And in many instances, I have to pull the Microsoft team to the side and say, listen, we already decided we're buying your software. When we ask you these questions about what it can and can't do, we need you to be candid with us and not give us the standard software licensing answer when the customer asks you, does your software do this? The stock answer for software people is, yes, it does that. In fact, I think for years and years, the software industry was trained that if a customer asks you, does the software do it? The answer is always yes. But when you're talking about security commitments and you're talking about due diligence in the context of security and privacy, you really have to explain to whoever you're dealing with to say, look, we need to understand the outer limits of what the software can do and what it can't do, because we have to make a risk assessment at that extreme outer level where we're at the limit of what it can and can't do, because that's where our risk assessment comes in. And so if you're just telling us it does everything when it doesn't, you're not helping us discharge our due diligence obligation and not helping us understand how to make an accurate risk assessment. And so sometimes if you tell them the context of why you're going into these details, it will help him understand and bring the right resources to the table so that you can get the right answers to these technical security questions, and making sure that your security commitments that are documented in your license agreement are appropriate for your business. Jumping into the enterprise enrollment, this is where you really are making some decisions about what products are going to be in the enrollment, which ones are going to be enterprise products and which ones are not, and exactly how you're going to structure it. Again, this is where a lot turns on how are you going to deal with Office, how are you going to deal with client access licensing, how are you going to deal with the desktop operating system. Once you start answering those questions, then your license model, your EA product stack, what's going to be your EA products, what's going to be your additional products, becomes very clear to understand. This per device and hybrid approach, this is what I was talking about earlier. I would say most of my clients today are in this hybrid model where they buy per device for the Windows operating system, and they're buying on a per user basis for the Office suite. So they're in the 365 on a user basis, but when it comes to the other products, they're still counting devices. And they do that in many instances because of the multiple user per device environments that exist in call centers, in hospitals, and other organizations, where the cost to just license on a per user basis across the board is cost prohibitive from the way they look at it, and therefore they're choosing sort of the best of both, looking for the low cost option in the call center, but still able to use the benefits of the cloud, particularly 365 for Office and related products on a user basis. We talked about the secure productive environment, SPE. This would be sort of the according to Microsoft, the best, you've got the good, better, best. This would be the best option that Microsoft would propose. This would be per user, primarily across the board, including for the desktop operating system. Has a lot of bells and whistles and flexibility built into the package, and it's quite pricey, is the feedback I get from most of my clients. But again, on a cost-adjusted basis, taking into account reduction in software asset management expenses as well as audit risks, I'm not exactly sure how big of a premium you're really paying for a SPE environment. The other option is the server and cloud enrollment. This is a way to license server and cloud products across the enterprise. Some people think that if you want to put SQL Server and Microsoft Windows Server in an enterprise agreement, you have to have a SCE. The answer is no. The SCE is optional. I have many clients that have SQL Server and Windows Server and an EA as EA products, but don't have a server and cloud enrollment. That's a decision that you just have to make on a case-by-case basis. So this is the enterprise enrollment. I want to come back here on the enterprise enrollment and pause. One of the documents that comes along with the enterprise enrollment is defining the enterprise and how you're going to define your enterprise. There's a form that asks you to check some boxes, and what it asks you is, do you want to include all of your affiliates or just certain named affiliates? Most of my clients choose all affiliates. Then there's a question that says, do you want to include your after acquired affiliates? Those would be organizations that you take a controlling interest of after the date of the agreement, or do you want to exclude after acquired affiliates? I recommend to my clients to exclude after acquired affiliates. I don't like a situation where a client is automatically required to count as qualified devices or qualified users devices or people in an organization that they just acquired that may or may not have been assimilated into their IT infrastructure, may or may not continue to be run as a standalone business, may or may not have its own enterprise agreement, may or may not have its own Microsoft licenses that it's already paid for. And therefore, my recommendation is to ensure the greatest deal of flexibility in connection with after acquired affiliates is to check the box when you do your enterprise enrollment to not include after acquired affiliates. Does that mean you can't roll them in later after you've taken stock of what they have and why and to what extent it would be a good idea to bring them in? Certainly not. You can always add them in through a true-up or a custom amendment or negotiation with Microsoft to have them included. But programmatically, it's my recommendation to my clients that they do not include them automatically. So that's just a small checkbox that can have big financial implications in connection with audits, and it takes a lot of pressure off of the due diligence from an IT perspective in connection with M&A activity. What I have found almost universally among my clients, and you can imagine that someone in my client base is probably doing an acquisition virtually every day. As a group, they're not that great at doing IT due diligence before the transaction closes. And so what happens is the deal closes and then IT gets dropped on it and procurement gets dropped on it, a big project to go clean it up. And it doesn't work well if you've got a license obligation immediately out of the gate to include these companies as part of your enterprise agreement. So for that reason, I recommend that we exclude after acquired affiliates. The MPSA is the new version of the select agreement. I have told my clients that are operating under select agreements that if they have an option to renew a select agreement and not sign an MPSA, to do so every time. There are a number of provisions, in my opinion, in the MPSA that are not as favorable as the provisions in the select agreement. And therefore, if you have a choice to stay on a select agreement or a select plus agreement for a period of time, and that's a negotiation item that you can have with Microsoft, it's been my suggestion to my clients, stick with the select or the select plus as long as you can. As I've said, they've been deprecated. One of the things that I do not like about the MPSA is that Microsoft has a policy that regardless of the size of your enterprise, regardless of the amount of negotiation that would be available in the context of an enterprise agreement with custom amendments and so forth, that they've pretty much been hard and fast that the terms of the MPSA are not negotiable. A number of things that I don't like about the MPSA. One of them is in the context of the audit provision. It requires the customer to give Microsoft access to servers and computers, which is something that cuts against the privacy and security policies of many of my clients, doesn't sit well with them. It's contrary to the way they've licensed with Microsoft and engaged in audit provisions with Microsoft for a very long time. And that particular provision in the MPSA is, among others, quite objectionable. Otherwise, the MPSA is a mechanism that will allow you to buy on a one-off approach. Contrary to what most people think, you can buy online services, including 365, through the MPSA. You don't need an enterprise agreement to get into the cloud. Different, new under the MPSA versus the select. If you remember, under the select, you had a designated reseller. Only that reseller could sell under your select agreement. Now, under the MPSA, you have the flexibility to work with multiple resellers under the same account. I advise my clients to standardize on a reseller that can serve their needs on a national and international basis, as the case may be, but to choose the vendors that do the most to help them with record keeping. From my perspective, part of what your software reseller is there to do for you is to keep records for you, so that if you need information, if you need copies of agreements, if you need entitlement reports, if you need historical purchase data, any of that type of information, I measure the quality of the reseller and in terms of their ability to help my clients manage their software assets. The service that they provide in terms of reporting is critical to what I think of as success. And there are many, many good resellers in the marketplace. I have many clients with SHI and have for many years. They're an excellent reseller, as is CDW. I have other clients that work with Dell that have had good success. So there are many, many good resellers in the marketplace. Where people get in trouble is when they move away from standardizing on a reseller, where they have people buying online from eBay or Maverick purchases at retail centers. That's where we find clients getting into the most trouble in audits. The clients that do the best in terms of audits are the ones that closely manage their procurement. They have centralized their procurement activities. They deal with one or just a very small number of vendors that have a comprehensive view of all of their records. And we find that that approach is the most successful in terms of managing your Microsoft licensing and reducing risk in connection with audits. Turning to our approach to assisting clients with actually doing the deals, and this would be a business that is growing, maybe through acquisition or organically or both, that's now of a size that makes sense to begin a negotiation on an enterprise agreement. More frequently with us, it's very large companies that may have enterprise agreements in place that are coming up for renewal. And we've got a very clear approach that we take that has been very successful for us over many years and many transactions. And I think it all boils down to getting clear, being very clear about what you need, what it is that you want, what it is that's important to you, what it is that you're trying to accomplish, and getting all of that on paper as early as possible in the deal. I can't tell you how many deals I got into where the client failed to define their requirements early, and you get to the end and you're negotiating the financial terms and conditions, and the people at Microsoft say, we can't agree to this. We've got this deal approved based on these terms and conditions, and there's no way now that we can consider these changes. And to avoid that, and to avoid having deals get sideways at the end, the requirements definition early on in the deal, and when I say early on, I'm talking about in a renewal no later than 90 days before the renewal date. Right? I'm talking about early in the deal, that you have your requirements clearly defined with all of the information compiled. What are your deal requirements? And communicating them at the outset of the negotiations. And my goal, and I work with my clients to make sure that the requirements are clearly defined. I ask myself, do we have everything in this PowerPoint that would be necessary for Microsoft to give us the proposals that we want? And as I mentioned, I like 3 proposals: get legal, a value proposal, and a best of breed, sort of the full package, highest end, what Microsoft would call good, better, best. I like to look at 3 options. What does it cost just to get legal at the cheapest cost possible? What does it cost to maybe have a hybrid? And what does it cost to go all in on a full cloud deal? And I want to make sure that before I ask for that my client has provided all of the requirements necessary for that proposal to be made. And I think that the clients that do that wind up being very successful in their negotiations. Those that struggle to define their requirements find that their deals drag on, find that there's inefficiency, miscommunication, misunderstanding, sometimes animosity, sometimes even worse. And I think a lot of these issues with Microsoft can be avoided by getting clear at the outset. So how to build a term sheet. One of the things that we do after we build the requirements, instead of jumping into redlining of documents back and forth, I like to work off of a term sheet. And for those of you who are able to, you can see the term sheet in the handout section. I'm showing it on my screen now. This is the term sheet builder that we've prepared for Microsoft. You can use it in connection with other publishers. A lot of these issues are interchangeable between publishers. It's an excellent tool that I use when I'm looking at negotiating cloud deals for clients. I'll go and look at all these categories and determine if changes need to be made. But you can see that there are a lot of issues here that need to be negotiated with Microsoft and any cloud vendor. And to go and try to just start with red lines of a document really is a very inefficient way to approach a negotiation of this magnitude. So we start with a term sheet. We start with the client's ask. We ask Microsoft to add a response. And then as we go through, we color code each of the terms with a color code. It's green if it's been resolved. It's yellow if it's still in discussion and not yet resolved. And if it's red if the request has been denied. And that gives executives within our client organization a very easy way to understand the progress that's being made in the negotiation. And it works extremely well. So this handout is available to you. Feel free to take it and use it in the context of Microsoft negotiations or any other cloud deal that you may be working on. As I said, I feel like many of these issues are certainly relevant to Microsoft deals, but can be relevant to any kind of a software license negotiation involving cloud. So as we get into building the term sheet, the purpose is it helps guide the negotiations. It helps us look at, okay, this is the language in the agreement that you sent us. This is why we don't like it. This is what we're proposing as a revision. And we talk through it through negotiation. It's not looking at red lines. It's looking through the term sheet. We use it to help our procurement teams understand exactly what the key issues are that need to be discussed in the meetings. It gives a structure to the meetings and the negotiations. It drives all of the negotiations and the discussions toward a contract that can be signed, because we're starting with the things in the contract that need to have the custom amendments, and we're working through those issues on behalf of the client with Microsoft. And then as those get resolved, they wind up in the proposed custom amendments, so that when we send our draft custom amendments back to Microsoft for consideration by their legal, there's a reference chart that you can look at. You can go to the term sheet and see, was it agreed or not agreed, and does the term sheet comply with the custom amendment? And it makes the process go very quickly and efficiently. What I find when you don't use a term sheet is Microsoft sends you their standard documents, you redline them, they cross out the red lines, then you send something back and that's a middle ground, then they cross that out or change it, and it just becomes extremely inefficient. So the use of a term sheet is recommended for enterprise customers negotiating enterprise agreements with Microsoft, but it's also a strategy that we use in negotiating all complicated transactions that we work on in the firm, whether it's a licensing deal or a services deal. We're going to use a term sheet, similar approach to what's outlined here for all of the deals that we work on, because it really does increase efficiency and guide the parties to a better transaction that's makes sure that all of the details that need to be covered are covered, and keeps the time used by our executives within our client organizations to the most efficient use of their time possible. Again, here's another view for those of you who weren't able to see it when I pulled it up before. you'll see that here's the term sheet. I just want you to point your attention to this section here in the limitation of liability. I would say that when it comes to the cloud, years ago in an on-premises deal, limitation of liability wasn't even an issue. I mean, it was rarely even discussed. But today, because of the cost of data breach, because of the issues of business interruption, the fact that with a cloud deal, you're putting in the hands of the vendor key business systems that could have a major monetary impact on your company, and the financial risk associated with that limitation of liability is typically one of the last terms that gets negotiated. In fact, I will frequently, when I'm negotiating a deal, I'll suggest to the parties that we leave the limitation of liability to the end. And I suggest that not because I want to not address this most important issue. In fact, I feel like I could talk about limitations of liability all day. It's not something I want to avoid. What I have found in my experience is if the commercial terms are still in flight, if some of the other terms and conditions are still in flight, nobody's going to get comfortable with approving a limitation of liability because neither side has all of the facts that are relevant to making the business decision about the limitation of liability. Particularly with Microsoft, if they don't have a full picture of the counts and the quantities and the options in terms of the monetary price, it is virtually useless to discuss limitation of liability. So I'm constantly pushing my clients to make sure that the commercials don't, that the commercial terms get resolved before you get into negotiating some of the key non-monetary legal terms, including, most importantly, the enhanced limitation of liability. Some of the other big ones are price protection. You're putting all of your eggs in one basket for a short period of time. What happens at the end of the term? What if they want to raise your prices 30, 40, 50%? What protection do you have against having to turn around because the price is too high and migrate off after you spent the better part of this term migrating on? You want to make sure that you have some price protection to know that you've got the right to a renewal term or that you've got some limited upside price protection to make sure that you can't be priced out of a favorable deal at the end of the term. The other one is suspension of services. Under what circumstances can the cloud provider turn you off? Again, you want to make sure that the suspension of services can only be made in the most limited circumstances. Another one is server migration. Do you have the right to migrate servers from on-prem to the cloud during the term? And if so, how do you get credit for the licenses that you paid for in your enterprise agreement when you want to move them to Azure or AWS? Many of my clients over the next 3 years are looking at significant increased adoption of either Azure or AWS or both. And they want to make sure that they're not locked into licensing Windows Server and SQL Server on-prem and then having to pay again to move that workload to the cloud. And so these are some of the key issues that get negotiated. And you can see just by looking at this term sheet and hearing me discuss the complexity of these topics, while just redlining the agreement would not be an efficient approach to negotiating these terms. Many of my clients are facing the question of how to transition to Office 365. I already have licenses for Exchange. I already have licenses for Microsoft Office Suite. How can I get to the end state of a cloud-based approach to mail and other services without paying twice for the software that I already have plus the software that I need? How do I transition over a period of time where I've got some portion of my estate moving to the cloud while a remainder of my estate remains on-prem. These are the challenges that most clients are facing today in transitioning, and there's a number of ways that I've seen it done. Clients will ask me, Rob, how has this been dealt with? What do I do? Well, there's a number of ways that you can do it. Microsoft has offered a number of strategies to my clients over the years that are designed to preserve the investment in the estate that's made today, thus reducing the impediment to cloud adoption. That could be through either lower priced or transition SKUs or other strategies that allow delayed payments, where you have the right to adopt over a certain period where your payments will start at a later period. But the biggest issue that you have to look at as you transition from on-premises to cloud is what are the privacy, security, and regulatory requirements that face your business. And the question becomes, can we do it legally? Is it permissible for a bank, a hospital, a international company that operates in Europe? Is it permissible? Based on the agreements that Microsoft will offer, will they comply with the applicable regulations? We talked about limitation of liability a little bit. Again, this is one that I recommend to leave at the end of the negotiation. I like to tell my clients, because sometimes the way limitations of liability are worded can be very difficult to understand. I like to tell my client, let's look at a probable claim scenario. Microsoft's servers get hacked, you've got a data breach, your customer data has been exposed. How would we go about calculating what those damages are? And then how would those damages be limited by the proposed limitation of liability? If you look at most cloud-based vendors, they're looking at a limitation of liability that eliminates your ability to recover for indirect or consequential damages. That is pretty typical in commercial deals. Both sides will waive the right to recover indirects. The problem in a cloud deal is one of the most common probable claim scenarios is a claim scenario involving indirect claims, that being claims that involve business interruption. So you have to look at the carve-outs, you have to look at carving out certain types of claims so that they won't be subject to the cap, and you've got to renegotiate the cap so that the cap is greater than either 6 months or 12 months of revenue. You need to be looking at caps that are closely related to your probable claim scenario. And the problem that I have with revenue-based caps is my clients' claim scenarios and risks may not have anything to do with the revenue that they pay for the service. And when you're talking about limitation of liability, you're talking about needing to be made whole for your probable claim scenarios. And in many instances, those claim scenarios involve dollars that will greatly exceed the revenue to be paid for the subscription. One of the things that's new in Microsoft's enterprise agreements is the so-called maximum usage true-up. I refer to it as the Highwater Mark. We've been trying to negotiate this language out of all of the deals that we're working on. The reason is that I don't think any of our clients can realistically determine what their maximum usage of a particular product may have been during the year unless they're looking at discovery data every day. It would be virtually impossible to do so. So this is one to look for. Highwater Mark true-up language is a big problem. And what I have found is that not very many companies are equipped to manage to it, and you don't want to be signing up for a true-up obligation that you can't manage to. Price protection we talked about. We recommend negotiating for a cap on price increases, at least for the first renewal term. So that would give you a fixed price for the first 3 years and a price cap for the next 3 years, giving you some price protection for a 6-year period. Business downturn is a custom amendment that we've been using for many years, particularly useful in the 9, 10, 11 time period where many of our customers were experiencing business downturns. It's an ability essentially to true down, which is a rare thing to have with Microsoft. If you have a significant business downturn, we recommend that companies negotiate for reductions in enterprise product counts in the event of a business downturn. Sometimes that can be measured in terms of employee count. It can be measured in terms of decline in revenue as a percentage. But business downturn provisions are very important because we don't know what's around the corner from a business perspective. And the last thing you want to have is a situation where your business is struggling, you're laying people off, but you're still paying for software on the basis of the enterprise before the reduction. We talked about restacking. This is a concept that can be very useful if you have uncertainty about what's going to happen with your needs during the term, or you're not 100% sure on all of your counts at the time that you need to do the deal. Restacking can be a very helpful provision to add flexibility to what might otherwise be a relatively inflexible licensing arrangement in the enterprise context. Audit rights, the best audit rights are no audit rights. Rarely we get clients that Microsoft will agree that to changes in their audit provisions. It's something that I think everyone should negotiate for. I think all organizations should clearly understand what Microsoft's audit rights are and fight hard to eliminate programmatic audits where you're just being named for no reason, and to otherwise reduce the harsher effects of Microsoft's audit rights. We talked about regulatory compliance. These are important issues, whether it's financial, HIPAA, or GDPR, which is the European regulations that are coming on in May of next year. The regulatory implications generally will drive a lot of the negotiations on a deal-by-deal basis. And I have found that Microsoft's basic deal documents are insufficient to cover the regulatory obligations that regulated clients are facing. It requires quite a bit of custom amendments in this context. We talked about the affiliate definition. You want to be careful that if you're doing business, people are accessing your IT infrastructure with less than 50% ownership, but you still need to include them for licensing purposes. You're going to need to get a custom amendment on the definition of affiliate. On acquisitions and divestitures, if you're engaged in a lot of M&A activity, I think you'll find that the base agreements that Microsoft offer are woefully inadequate to cover businesses that are active with needing to acquire and divest entities, very weak on the ability and rights to offer transition services to divested entities, and these are areas that we spend a lot of time with custom amendments. I want to thank everybody for your time today. I hope that you get a benefit from the term sheet builder. For those of you that have questions, if you enter them into the chat box on the side, we will endeavor to answer your questions offline. And thank you very much for attending.